Honey, I need to tell you something. My wife Jessica walked into the kitchen with a smile I hadn't seen in months, her eyes sparkling in a way that made me stop preparing dinner. She leaned against the counter in our Denver kitchen, still wearing the gray business suit that cost more than my weekly salary. The expensive perfume she started wearing after her promotion hung in the air like a cloud of guilt. I'm in love. The words came out of her with cruel ease, as if she were commenting on the weather. With Richard Morrison, my boss. And he's in love with me. I kept stirring the tomato sauce, the automatic movements keeping me steady as my world collapsed. My name is Jim, I'm 32 years old, and I just found out that my 5-year marriage was a lie. While I was building our house, our life, our dreams, Jessica was building a parallel relationship with a man who signed her paychecks. We're moving into his penthouse next week, she continued, now removing her wedding ring and placing it on the counter with a metallic clang that echoed like a gunshot. The divorce papers are all ready with my lawyer. I turned off the heat. The sauce still bubbled softly, as if protesting the tense silence that had taken over the kitchen. Jessica expected tears, screams, maybe even begging. Anything but the unnatural calm that came over me. Richard Morrison, I repeated the name slowly, as if memorizing it. The Richard Morrison from Morrison Tech Solutions. Yes. She frowned, clearly confused by my reaction. What Jessica didn't know was that I knew Richard Morrison much better than she imagined. Not personally, but professionally. Every security vulnerability in his systems, every flaw in his protocols, every blind spot in his digital infrastructure. For 3 years, I worked as a freelance cybersecurity consultant, and Morrison Tech was on my list of potential targets for business proposals. I never sent them because I thought it would be a conflict of interest, since Jessica worked there. Now, as she looked at me with that superior expression, as if she had just delivered the final blow, I was already mentally calculating the first move in a game she didn't even know had begun. Jim. Her voice had a hint of uncertainty. Aren't you going to say anything? I smiled. A small, almost imperceptible smile. Congratulations on your promotion to the boss's heart. Jessica blinked, clearly expecting a different reaction. She wanted drama. She wanted me to make a scene so she could feel justified in her betrayal. I'll stay in the guest room tonight, she said, her voice now less confident. Tomorrow I'll start packing my things. Sure. I'll heat up some pizza for dinner. You don't have to worry about cooking ever again. After Jessica went upstairs, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table. The screen lit up my face as I typed quickly, accessing files I had compiled years ago on vulnerabilities in mid-sized tech companies. Morrison Tech Solutions appeared on my screen like a treasure map, every system mapped, every weakness documented, every opportunity cataloged. Jessica thought she was leaving me for a powerful and successful man. What she didn't realize was that she had just handed me the keys to his kingdom on a silver platter. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I began to devise not just a plan for revenge, but something much bigger. If Jessica wanted to play dirty, I would turn that game into something she could never have imagined. The tomato sauce still perfumed the kitchen, but now it smelled of new possibilities. If you're enjoying seeing how betrayal can turn into the greatest opportunity of someone's life, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because Jessica and Richard still had no idea what was about to happen. And when they found out, it would be too late to stop what I had set in motion. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of expensive coffee coming from the kitchen. Jessica was preparing her special breakfast, Eggs Benedict with smoked salmon, the same thing she made when she wanted to impress someone important. Good morning, Jim. Her voice had that professional tone she used in presentations. Richard is coming to pick up some boxes I left here yesterday. Of course he is. I continued drinking my usual black coffee while watching my wife of 5 years get ready to impress another man in our kitchen. Jessica had always been ambitious. That was what attracted me to her when we met at university. With a degree in business administration and an MBA in finance, she rose through the corporate ranks with the determination of someone born to lead. But at some point, that ambition turned into something darker. Richard Morrison arrived at exactly 9 o'clock. 52 years old, perfectly coiffed gray hair, wearing a suit that cost more than my car. He walked into my house as if it were his own, greeting Jessica with a kiss on the cheek that lasted 2 seconds longer than necessary. Jim. He extended his hand with that CEO smile he had perfected over decades of negotiations. Jessica has told me a lot about you. I'm sure she has. Probably about how I was a freelance consultant who worked from home in my pajamas, while she built a real tech empire with real men. Richard is revolutionizing the enterprise solutions market, Jessica said, her eyes shining with an admiration I'd never seen when she talked about my work. His company has grown 400% in the last 2 years. I knew those numbers. I also knew how they were achieved. Morrison Tech Solutions wasn't exactly an innovative technology company. It was more of a sophisticated reselling operation that bought off-the-shelf solutions, repackaged them with a custom interface, and sold them at premium prices to companies that didn't understand what they were buying. The 400% growth came mainly from government contracts that Richard secured through political connections, not from actual technological innovation. I had discovered this 3 months ago, when I was still considering making a proposal to them. Jessica has a natural talent for identifying market opportunities, Richard continued, his hand resting on her shoulder. That's why I offered her the position of Director of New Business Development. The director position she had mentioned last night. The promotion that came with the apartment, the new car, and apparently, the new relationship. When did you two start working so closely together? I asked, keeping my tone casual. Jessica and Richard exchanged a glance. One of those meaningful looks that established couples develop. Well, Jessica began, Richard recognized my potential within the first month. We started having one-on-one meetings to discuss business strategy. One-on-one meetings. How romantic. Jessica's professional chemistry is exceptional, Richard added. Some people just connect on a deeper level when it comes to business acumen. Business acumen. That's what they were calling it now. As they talked about strategic synergy and visionary alignment, I noticed the details that told the real story. Jessica's engagement ring, which cost 2 months of my salary, had been replaced with something much more expensive. The watch on Richard's wrist was a Patek Philippe that costs more than our house. But what caught my eye most was the leather briefcase Richard was carrying. A genuine Hermes, with his initials engraved in gold. Inside, I saw documents with a Morrison Tech letterhead. Documents he had apparently brought home last night. Jim, Richard said, checking his expensive watch, Jessica mentioned that you work in system security. Maybe we could talk about some consulting opportunities. The irony was delicious. The man who was stealing my wife wanted to hire my services to protect the company where he had met her. It depends on the type of system, I replied. I work primarily with vulnerability identification and intrusion protection. Perfect. Our infrastructure is growing rapidly. It would be interesting to have someone check our weak points. Our weak points. If he knew that I had already mapped every security vulnerability at Morrison Tech over the past 3 years, he might not be so confident. Jessica began stacking boxes near the door. Work clothes, mostly. Expensive blazers, designer shoes, accessories she had bought in recent months with the performance bonus Richard was paying her. Jim, about the house, Jessica said, avoiding my gaze. My lawyer said that since we don't have children and we both contributed financially, the division of assets should be pretty straightforward. Pretty straightforward. 5 years of marriage reduced to an Excel spreadsheet. Sure, I replied. I'll talk to a lawyer too. Just to make sure everything is fair. Richard carried the boxes to his car. A black Tesla Model S, the kind of car Jessica always said we would buy when it was our turn. Apparently, her turn had come. It just no longer included our. After they left, I sat on the living room couch that Jessica and I had chosen together 2 years ago. The cushion still had the imprint of where she used to sit to watch Netflix on Friday nights. I grabbed my laptop and opened the files I had compiled on Morrison Tech Solutions. For 3 years, I had studied that company like a predator studies its prey. Not to attack, but because I was considering working with them. The irony was that Jessica never knew that I probably understood her company better than she did. The documents on the screen showed a clear pattern. Morrison Tech was growing too fast, taking on contracts that were too big, promising solutions that they didn't have the capacity to deliver internally. It was a bubble waiting to burst. And Richard Morrison, despite all his arrogance and superficial charm, was steering a technological Titanic straight toward an iceberg that only I could see coming. My phone buzzed. A message from Jessica. I forgot to mention, Richard wants you to know that the consulting offer is real. He was impressed with your resume. My resume. which she had apparently shown him without consulting me. I typed back, "Interesting. I'll consider it." But as I sent the message, I was already opening a different folder on my computer. A folder labeled Special Projects, which contained 3 years of detailed research on systemic vulnerabilities in medium-sized companies. Morrison Tech Solutions was about to discover that hiring the cuckolded husband to protect the company where you stole his wife was not just ironic. It was the stupidest decision Richard Morrison had ever made in his life. And while Jessica was probably celebrating her new life and new love in his apartment, I began to figure out how to turn Morrison Tech's greatest weakness into my greatest opportunity. What neither of them realized yet was that they had just handed me the keys to the castle they wanted to defend. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Richard wanted to discuss the cybersecurity consulting contract in person. The irony was so perfect it almost hurt. Jessica left the house that morning wearing a dress I had never seen before, red, expensive, the kind she used to say was inappropriate for the office. Apparently, the rules change when you're sleeping with your boss. "Have a good day at work," she said, kissing my cheek with the same coldness as always. As if the last 5 days hadn't happened. As if she hadn't just traded me in for a man 20 years older with a bigger bank account. "You too. Say hi to Richard for me." She paused at the door, looking at me with a strange expression. "Jim, are you okay? You seem different." Different. If only she knew how different I was becoming with each passing hour. "I'm great, Jess. Actually, I've never felt better." 2 hours later, I was at the Morrison Tech Solutions office on the 42nd floor of a glass building in downtown Denver. The view was impressive. You could see the entire city spread out like a giant electronic circuit board. Richard welcomed me into his office, which was the size of my entire apartment. Italian leather furniture, paintings that looked expensive, and a conference table where he probably made decisions that affected hundreds of employees. "Jim, I'm so glad you agreed to come." He shook my hand with the exaggerated enthusiasm of a salesman. "Jessica told me a lot about your work. Impressive resume." Jessica had shared my resume with him. Of course she had. Probably during one of those strategic meetings of theirs. "Thank you. I'm also curious to learn more about Morrison Tech Systems." Richard called his assistant. "Bring us both some coffee. And call Jessica to join the meeting." Jessica arrived 10 minutes later. She had touched up her makeup and styled her hair in a way I knew she did when she wanted to impress someone. The same way she did before our first dates 6 years ago. "Jim." Her voice had that fake professional tone. "I'm so glad you're considering working with us." Working with us. As if we were a happy team. Richard opened a thick folder. "Our infrastructure has grown rapidly over the past 2 years. We have contracts with the Colorado government, 3 universities, and we just closed a deal with a consortium of hospitals." I knew about these contracts. I had researched each one. "Impressive growth," I commented. "What kind of vulnerabilities are you facing?" "Mainly phishing attempts targeting employees," Jessica replied, looking at Richard like a student seeking approval from her professor. Richard implemented new password protocols that reduced incidents by 60%. Password protocols. How lovely. What about the main servers? Do you regularly audit administrative access? Richard and Jessica exchanged a glance. A glance that lasted half a second longer than it should have. "We have an internal team for that," Richard said. "But it's always good to have an outside perspective." Outside perspective. I suppressed a smile. I spent the next 2 hours listening to them describe a security system that I already knew was full of holes. They talked about impenetrable firewalls that I could bypass in 15 minutes. They discussed backup protocols that left windows open wide enough to drive a truck through. But what caught my attention most was the dynamic between them. Jessica hung on Richard's every word as if it were divine revelation. Richard, in turn, treated her like a personal discovery, something precious he had found and molded to his own vision. "Jessica has a natural talent for identifying weaknesses in systems," Richard said, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "She was the one who discovered the vulnerability in the university system that earned us the $2 million contract. The vulnerability she discovered had been publicly documented for 6 months. Anyone with basic access to Google could have found it." "Very clever," I said, looking directly at Jessica. "I always knew you had a knack for finding Opportunities. She blushed. She actually blushed, as if I had paid her a genuine compliment rather than made a snide remark about her ability to identify wealthy married men. The meeting ended with Richard offering me a 3-month consulting contract. $50,000 to evaluate and strengthen Morrison Tech's entire security system. I need complete access, I said. Administrative passwords, access codes, permission to test all systems without restrictions. Of course. We have complete confidence in your expertise. Trust. What an interesting word coming from him. I signed the contract right there. 3 months of unrestricted access to systems I already knew better than they did. 3 months to do whatever I wanted, with official approval. When can I start? I asked. How about tomorrow? Jessica can give you a tour of the facilities and introduce you to the IT staff. Jessica could give me a tour. Like a tour guide on my own revenge. In the elevator, descending from the 42nd floor, Jessica finally spoke. Jim, I know this is weird, but I appreciate you being so professional about everything. Professional. I looked at her through the reflection in the polished elevator doors. It's just work, Jess. Nothing personal. Still, I know Richard can be intimidating at first, but he really is a visionary. He's turning Morrison Tech into something revolutionary. Revolutionary. The company that sold repackaged solutions and profited from government contracts through political connections. I'm sure he is. The elevator stopped on the ground floor. When the doors opened, Jessica hesitated. Jim, are you sure you're okay with all this? You seem very calm. Very calm. If only she knew that while she was talking about Richard's revolutionary vision, I was mentally cataloging exactly how to destroy every system in his company in less than a week. I've never been better, Jess. In fact, I think this may be the best opportunity of my career. She smiled with that barely concealed relief. Poor Jessica. She really believed that I had accepted the situation with masculine grace. That I was being a good loser who knew when to walk away gracefully. As I walked to my car, I grabbed my phone and opened the files I had compiled on Morrison Tech. 3 years of detailed research on every vulnerability, every weakness, every systematic flaw that could be exploited. Richard Morrison had just handed me the keys to the castle I had been planning to destroy since the first day Jessica mentioned his name. And Jessica, my beloved wife of 5 years, had just volunteered to be my personal guide through the process. The irony was so perfect that I actually laughed out loud in the parking lot. A sound that hadn't come out of me in weeks. 3 months of total access. $50,000 to demolish the empire of the man who stole my wife. As I drove home, my mind was already 3 steps ahead, planning not only how to destroy Morrison Tech, but how to use the wreckage to build something Richard could never imagine. Jessica thought she had traded a freelance consultant for a tech mogul. In 3 months, she would discover that she had traded a future billionaire for a man whose company was about to turn to dust. And when that happened, she would realize that the greatest opportunity of her life was sleeping in the bed next to her every night. But that realization would come too late to change anything. The next morning, Jessica took me to see the Morrison Tech facilities as promised. She was radiant, wearing a dress that cost more than our electric bill, introducing me to her colleagues as if she were the hostess of a social event. Everyone, this is Jim, she said, stumbling slightly over the word husband. He's going to be our new security consultant. The hesitation did not go unnoticed. Nor did the way she avoided my gaze when she talked about our professional relationship. The tour began on the ground floor. Luxurious reception area, waiting room with business magazines arranged geometrically, giant aquarium that probably cost more than my car. Everything designed to impress clients who came to sign million-dollar contracts. Richard transformed this place, Jessica commented proudly, her voice echoing in the marble atrium. When he took over 3 years ago, it was just another corporate office with no personality. 3 years. Exactly when I began my detailed study of the company. On the 2nd floor, she showed me the server room. My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral. It was smaller than I had imagined, but much more vulnerable. Impressive setup, I commented, watching the server racks humming quietly. How many terabytes of storage do you have here? 250, Jessica replied, clearly pleased to know the answer. Richard invested heavily in infrastructure last year. 250 terabytes of corporate data, government contracts, customer information, and probably a few things Richard would rather keep private. All behind a digitally locked door that I could hack in less than 10 minutes. On the third floor, I met the IT team. 5 people, all young, all clearly overworked. The kind of team that works with what it has, without questioning the decisions from above too much. Jim is going to do a complete audit of our systems, Jessica announced to them. We want to make sure we're protected against any kind of intrusion. Any kind of intrusion. The irony was delicious. Kevin, the team leader, greeted me with the enthusiasm of someone who would finally get help with problems he had been reporting for months. "Man, what a relief to have someone with real experience here," he said quietly when Jessica stepped away to take a call. "We have some security gaps that keep me up at night." "What kind of gaps?" "Administrative passwords that have never been changed since installation. Backup protocols that leave Windows open. And don't get me started on the remote accesses that Richard insists on keeping active all the time. Always on remote access. That would simplify everything. Can I see the documentation?" Kevin looked around, making sure no one was listening. "Officially, our security is robust and impenetrable. But between us..." He shook his head. "It's a miracle we haven't been hacked yet. A miracle, or maybe no one has been interested enough. Until now." Jessica returned, hanging up the phone with an annoyed expression. "Richard is stuck in a meeting with investors. He said to start today if you want. Kevin can give you access to the systems." Access to the systems. On the first day. Richard Morrison either really trusted me, or he was so distracted by his new romantic conquest that he didn't think about the implications of giving full access to a betrayed husband. I spent the next 4 hours immersed in Morrison Tech Systems. On the outside, I looked like a diligent consultant doing his job. On the inside, I was like an archaeologist discovering a lost site. Every folder I opened revealed new vulnerabilities. Default passwords on critical systems. Security logs that no one had reviewed in months. Contracts with clauses that violated federal regulations. Emails between Richard and business partners that, at the very least, bordered on questionable practices. But what really caught my attention was a folder called Special Projects. Password protected, but using 2018 encryption that I had broken hundreds of times. Inside that folder, I found the treasure map. Inflated contracts with the Colorado government. Systematic overbilling for services. Bids won through insider information that Richard obtained via political connections. And most interestingly, a series of shell companies he used to launder money from government contracts. Morrison Tech Solutions wasn't just a tech company with security issues. It was a money laundering operation disguised as a legitimate business. Richard Morrison wasn't just an arrogant CEO who stole my wife. He was a criminal who built an empire based on government fraud. And Jessica, my beloved wife of 5 years, was about to become an accomplice to it all. Around 4 in the afternoon, Jessica appeared at my temporary desk. "How's it going? Found any problems?" "A few things that need to be adjusted," I replied, discreetly saving the files I had copied. "Nothing that can't be solved with time and proper access." Richard will be relieved. He was worried you might find serious flaws. Serious flaws. If only she knew I had just uncovered enough evidence to send her billionaire boyfriend to federal prison for 20 years. "I'm going to need to work a few nights here. Penetration tests are more effective outside of business hours." "No problem. I'll give you your 24-hour access ID." 24-hour access. Jessica was literally handing me the keys to the castle I planned to bring down. At 6 in the evening, when the office emptied, I was alone with 250 terabytes of corporate secrets and an internet connection that allowed me to access any system in the company. I connected my personal laptop to the internal network and began the real work. First, I copied all the files from the Special Projects folder to a secure server I had set up years ago. Evidence of tax fraud, money laundering, and government corruption. Enough to destroy Richard Morrison and anyone associated with him. Second, I installed a monitoring program that would give me permanent remote access to all systems, even after my contract ended. An invisible backdoor that no Morrison Tech technician would be able to detect. Third, I began mapping the company's financial vulnerabilities. Bank accounts, investments, cash flow. If I wanted to destroy Richard Morrison, I needed to understand exactly where it would hurt the most. At 10 o'clock that night, my phone buzzed. Jessica. Still working? Richard is impressed with your dedication. Security has no hours, I replied, as I downloaded the bank records for the last 3 years. Tell him I've found some interesting vulnerabilities. We'll talk tomorrow. Interesting vulnerabilities. If only she knew that I had just discovered that Morrison Tech had been under investigation by the FBI for 6 months, and that Richard Morrison was 2 steps away from a federal indictment. If you're curious to see how these vulnerabilities will bring down an empire built on lies, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because while Jessica was cozying up in Richard's penthouse that night, celebrating the success of infiltrating his company as a security consultant, I was in the empty office, methodically building the case that would send them to prison. And when I was done, Richard Morrison would discover that hiring the betrayed husband to protect his criminal secrets was the most stupidly ironic decision he ever made. The Real security audit was just beginning. The first bomb exploded on a Tuesday at 9 in the morning. Richard was in the conference room presenting the quarterly results to investors when his assistant entered with an expression of barely concealed panic. "Mr. Morrison, there's an urgent call from the legal department." Richard motioned for them to continue without him and took the call in the hallway. From my station downstairs, I could see through the glass walls his expression change from confidence to confusion, then to something close to terror. The IRS had opened a formal investigation into tax irregularities at Morrison Tech Solutions. Someone had sent a complete dossier documenting 3 years of overbilling on government contracts. That someone, of course, was me. But that was just the appetizer. Richard returned to the meeting trying to maintain his composure, but he had already lost control of the narrative. Investors began asking uncomfortable questions about internal auditing and tax compliance. As he stammered through explanations, Jessica appeared at my desk. "Jim, have you heard about this IRS investigation? Richard is saying it's a misunderstanding, but are you worried that it will affect your new position?" She blushed. "It's not just that. It's just that Richard has always been so careful with legal issues. It doesn't make sense." It didn't make sense because she didn't know the real Richard Morrison. The version she had fallen in love with was a carefully constructed persona, not the man who had been laundering money through shell companies for 3 years. "I'm sure it will work out," I said, returning to the screen where I discreetly monitored every movement of the company in real time. The second bomb exploded at 2 in the afternoon. Morrison Tech's main client, the Colorado Hospital Consortium, sent a notice of immediate contract termination. They had discovered that the security systems Richard promised to implement were actually open-source software repackaged and sold for 10 times the original price. This information had reached them through an anonymous email containing detailed technical documentation and source code comparisons. Once again, that anonymous person was me. Richard began making frantic phone calls. His voice echoed throughout the entire company as he tried to contain the damage, promising explanations he couldn't give and guarantees he couldn't deliver. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Jessica was visibly nervous. "The company's stock is down 15% today," she whispered, constantly looking over her shoulder. Richard canceled all his meetings and locked himself in his office with the lawyers. "Problems happen," I replied, without looking up from my screen. "Solid companies overcome them." But Morrison Tech wasn't solid. It was a house of cards built on systemic fraud, and I was methodically removing each supporting card. The third bombshell was the most devastating. At 5:30, when most of the employees had left, Richard finally came down to confront me. He had discovered that I was the source of the investigations. "You," he said, his voice trembling with restrained anger. "You did this." "Did what, exactly?" "Don't play dumb with me, Jim. The IRS, the cancelled contracts, someone sent inside information to our competitors. And you're the only one with access to the systems." I calmly saved my work and turned to face him. "Richard, if you're implying that I broke my confidentiality agreement, I'm saying you're a betrayed husband trying to destroy my company out of personal revenge." Brutal honesty finally emerged. No more pretending we were professional colleagues. No more pretending this was just business. "Personal revenge," I repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting perspective." Richard was sweating now, his executive composure completely evaporated. "You have no idea what you're messing with. This company has contracts with the federal government. You're committing corporate treason. Corporate treason. I chuckled softly. You want to talk about treason? It was then that I opened the folder I had prepared specifically for this moment. 500 pages of meticulous documentation on every crime Richard Morrison had committed over the past 3 years. Inflated contracts with the state of Colorado. Shell companies for money laundering. Bribing public officials for inside information on bids. Pirated software sold as intellectual property. Tax evasion through offshore accounts. With each item I listed, the color drained from Richard's face. And my favorite, I continued, turning to the last page, use of position of authority to coerce female employees into intimate relationships in exchange for promotions. He recoiled as if I had slapped him. Jessica wasn't the first, Richard. Nor was she the second. There's a whole folder of emails, messages, evidence of at least 6 similar cases in the last 2 years. You can't prove any of this. I can and I will. In fact, I already have. The FBI received a complete copy of this dossier this morning. Richard collapsed into the nearest chair. The FBI. Financial money laundering operation using government contracts to fund shell companies. It's a federal crime, Richard. We're talking 20 to 25 years in prison. He looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost. You planned this from the beginning. I planned it from the moment you walked into my kitchen and shook my hand as if we were friends. From the moment Jessica described me as a freelance consultant, while you were a technology visionary. I grabbed my laptop and started unplugging the cables. The truth is, you were never a visionary, Richard. You're just a white-collar criminal who got lucky for a few years. And Jessica? She never fell in love with you. She fell in love with the fantasy of power and money that you represented. Richard tried to compose himself. Even if you have evidence, even if you can incriminate me, you've destroyed your own life too. Jessica will never forgive you for that. Jessica. I smiled, closing my laptop. Let me tell you something about my wife that you clearly didn't understand in all those months of strategic meetings. I picked up my phone and showed him the screen. A series of messages Jessica had sent me over the last week. Jim, Richard is acting strange. Talking about moving money to offshore accounts. Jim, I found documents in his apartment that I don't understand. Companies I've never heard of. Jim, I think I made a mistake. Can I talk to you? Richard read the messages with growing horror. Jessica may have been swept away by the life of luxury you offered her, but she's not stupid. And when she realized she was getting involved with a criminal, well, let's just say she decided to cooperate with the investigation. The truth was even more devastating than any revenge I could have planned. Jessica had discovered the truth about Richard 2 weeks ago, and instead of confronting him directly, she had come to me. Not because she still loved me, but because she needed a way out that wouldn't destroy her in the process. Where do you think I got access to the documents in his apartment, Richard? How do you think I found out about the offshore accounts? Richard was now completely pale, his hands shaking slightly. But there's one thing even Jessica doesn't know yet, I continued, putting my phone away. About what I'm going to do with all this information. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. I'm going to use every contact, every system, every vulnerability I've discovered to build the most powerful cybersecurity company in the region. Morrison Tech will be just the first domain I acquire when you guys go bankrupt next week. Richard tried to speak, but no sound came out. And the best part? I'm going to do it all legally. Every penny will be clean, every contract transparent, every employee treated with respect. I'm going to build the empire you thought you had, but for real. I finished putting away my equipment and headed for the door. The federal agents are coming tomorrow at 8 in the morning with search and seizure warrants. You have one night to decide whether you want to cooperate with the investigation or face the full force of the law alone. I stopped at the door and turned around one last time. Oh, and Richard? Jessica is going to break up with you tonight. She's already gone home. Our home. Apparently, finding out that her boyfriend is a criminal was enough to make her rethink her priorities. The look on Richard's face when he realized he had lost everything, his company, his freedom, and even the woman for whom he had risked it all, was more satisfying than any violent revenge could have been. As I walked to the elevator, I could hear him making desperate phone calls, trying to find someone, anyone, who could save him from the total collapse he was about to face. But as the elevator doors closed and I began my descent from the 42nd floor, I knew that Richard Morrison had just discovered something I had learned long ago. There is no salvation when you build your kingdom on lies. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over Denver, I would begin to build my own kingdom on the only foundation that truly matters, the truth. 6 months later, I was at the grand opening of my cybersecurity company when the news came on the television in the reception area. Richard Morrison was sentenced today to 22 years in federal prison for money laundering and fraud in government contracts. The images showed him being led away in handcuffs from the courthouse, a dramatic fall for the man who once commanded a 40-story empire. Jessica approached, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "You don't look surprised," she said, offering me a glass. "There are no surprises when you help write the script." She laughed nervously. Our relationship was still rebuilding. She had come home that fateful night, begging for forgiveness and offering full cooperation with the authorities. But forgiving didn't mean forgetting. "Jim, I know I made terrible mistakes. I let ambition blind me to who Richard really was." "You fell in love with the illusion of power," I replied, watching the employees of my new company celebrate. "But at least you had the courage to admit it when you discovered the truth." Kevin, my former contact at Morrison Tech, now worked as my company's chief security officer. He approached me with a huge smile. "Jim, we just signed a contract with the Colorado government. They want us to audit all the systems Morrison Tech installed." The irony was perfect. I would fix the very problems Richard had created, but this time I would do everything right. "And there's more," Kevin continued. 3 former Morrison Tech clients contacted us today. It looks like our reputation is spreading. My company, Secure Core Solutions, had been born from the wreckage of Morrison Tech. I bought the company's assets for a fraction of their value during the bankruptcy auction, kept the honest employees, and built something Richard never could, a truly ethical company. Jessica touched my arm gently. "You turned the worst betrayal of your life into the greatest opportunity." "It wasn't the betrayal that changed me," I replied, looking out the window at the city that now had a thriving and honest cybersecurity company. "It was deciding to use that pain to build something greater than my revenge." Over the next few months, SecureCore grew exponentially. Legitimate government contracts, corporate clients who actually got the value they paid for, employees treated with respect, and complete transparency in every transaction. What Richard had built through fraud and manipulation, I built through competence and integrity. The most profound transformation was not business-related, but personal. I discovered that true revenge is not destroying your enemy, it is becoming so successful that comparison becomes irrelevant. Jessica and I are working to rebuild our marriage, now based on complete honesty instead of unspoken expectations. Not all relationships survive this kind of trauma, but some emerge stronger. Richard Morrison taught me a valuable lesson: empires built on lies always collapse. But empires built on truth and hard work create lasting legacies. If this story of how to turn betrayal into triumph has inspired you, subscribe to our channel right now for more stories of overcoming adversity and poetic justice that prove that good always wins in the end. Today, when I pass by the building where Morrison Tech used to operate, now converted into residential apartments, I feel neither anger nor vengeful satisfaction. I feel gratitude. Because sometimes we need to lose everything to discover what we are truly capable of. Richard Morrison tried to destroy me by stealing my wife and underestimating my abilities. Instead, he gave me the fuel to build an empire he could never have imagined.